Well, my name is Major Greg Miller. I work in the Directorate of History and Heritage for the Canadian Armed Forces, and where I am a section head for the dress and ceremonial section. I'm an infantry officer by trade, and this is just one of my out-of-trade postings. Well, I think horns have been used in conjunction with militaries as long as militaries have been existing. But the first account of a horn being used in battle to send a specific command was in 1214 at the Battle of Bugle, where the French used a horn sounding to signal the assault for the final charge. It developed from there into 1544, when the British Army started using a number of calls to send various messages, routine and otherwise, in with the Army units. There are 3 different types of calls, and bugle calls are not restricted to purely infantry or cavalry units or artillery units. They're used throughout the Army because they use it to set the routine. The calls were used to set the routine of units in garrison. So in the days before the watch, soldiers set their day by the bugle calls. It told them when to get up. It told them when to get out of bed. It told them when to go eat. It told them when to get on their horses, when to start marching, when to fire their rifles, when to stop firing the rifles. So very much the calls are broken up, and they're broken up into regimental calls, which are very specific to the specific unit that they belong to. So a rifle regiment, like the Queen's Own Rifles, would have a specific call that would be related to the commanding officer of the Queen's Own Rifles. And then there are other calls, which are field calls, which everyone understands it's the same call, because you don't want to have a command being given across the battlefield that's different for the Queen's Own Rifles or the Royal Canadian Regiment. So calls like ceasefire, like stand fast, and last post are consistent calls. And then there are routine calls, and those are the ones that are used in garrison. Time to get up, time to go to sleep, time to feed the horses, and words like that. Well, the first ones were essentially animal horn and long tubular shapes. And it's based on the sound generation device of a trumpet. That's where the term trumpet comes from. And it is normally a long tubed with a bell at the end. And that starts way back. There are accounts in the Bible of Joshua playing his horn to signal things throughout the accounts that are in the Bible. And then it slowly progresses. We have horns in the Roman times, which are actually cylindrical ones that go around the body of the musician who's playing them, to where it developed into what we have today. And I like to use the term as that all bugles are trumpets, but not all trumpets are bugles. The characteristic difference between a bugle and a trumpet is the shape of the bell and the tube leading into the bell. So a bugle has a conical shape, whereas a trumpet has a cylindrical shape. So as you can see, the bugle starts wide and narrows down in a cone, whereas a trumpet is less severe and comes forward in roughly a cylinder when it leaves the bell. Bugle differs from the trumpet in the mouthpiece. The mouthpiece is different from a trumpet mouthpiece. There are no valves, and the shape of the bell, the cylindrical shape, likes the conical shape on the bugle. The soldier plays the bugle with using his lips and his embouchure, so the shape of his lips, to control the tone or the note that is being played. Whereas a trumpet has the valves that also alter the notes that can be played and increases the range of the instrument. A bugle only has 8 solid notes that it plays. And of those 8 notes, only 5 of them are considered used in the normal range. There are 2 that are much higher that are partially used, and 1 that is much lower that is seldom used. So there's 5 notes in the middle that are played, that a bugle plays, whereas a trumpet has the full range of octaves to play. So because a bugle is a battlefield communication device, it sends commands across the frontage of a battalion in action. It is played by a soldier, because it's just like as if it was a radio, except in times when the radios didn't exist. So the soldier plays the bugle and acts as what we call the modern day signaler for the officer who's in charge. Whereas a musician is a professional musician. He's not a soldier. He plays music, and that distinction actually came in the British Army system in about 1850, where professional musicians started to come into the British Army, and the buglers and drummers within an infantry battalion or an infantry regiment were actually soldiers who were taught to become buglers and drummers. One of the things we do at Directorate of History and Heritage is when remains of First World War soldiers are found in France or wherever they're found in the world, it's another section of the Directorate is responsible for identifying those remains if we can, because we believe that we need to give all Canadian soldiers who we find a burial by his regiment with his family present, if we can do that. And so recently we have identified a soldier from the Battle of Hill 70 who was killed in August 1917, and his remains were found, and the casualty identification section labored hard to find out who this young soldier was. And one of the items that was found with this soldier was a small hunting horn. And so they kept that aside, because there's all kinds of artifacts that are always found with these soldiers. And then when we narrowed it down and the DNA analysis was done, and we identified that this is going to be Private Priddle of the 16th Battalion, we went looking for a picture of him. And the only picture that we found was Private Priddle playing a bugle. So in 1917, when Private Priddle was in the 16th Battalion overseas, he was a bugler. And it would therefore be logical to think that that horn that he had with him, he carried because he was a bugler. Well, bugle calls and that are, because it's a communication device in military communications, we always like to be three things. We like to be clear, concise, and brief. So bugle calls being short and very clear fits in with normal military communications. So a clear, short bugle call is what we need to pass an order that everyone understands. So at a military funeral, there are 2 calls that are played. We play last post, which is the call for setting the final watch of the day and essentially the end of the day, the lowering of the flag, and going to sleep. And then we play what's called rouse. And rouse is the call to get out of bed. People confuse rouse with reveille. Reveille is wake up. Rouse, much shorter, is get out of bed. So playing last post followed by the rouse signifies the going to bed, or the laying down of the soldier, and then the rising up of the soldier. So those are the 2 that are played in Canadian military funerals. But the most popular, and therefore most knowledgeable to the world, may be what's called taps. And taps is a United States Army adaptation just after the Civil War of the last post. So taps, it's 24 notes, all strung together in a very melodic nature, that the United States Army adopted in about 1885 as their version of last post. The bugle is still in use in various regiments of the Canadian Army, a particular use in the ceremonial guard. Drummers in the pipe band, because they would be infantrymen, not musicians, carry a bugle and are taught to play the bugle. So it's used there in the Canadian context. Not used on a daily basis across the Canadian Armed Forces for sending messages or calls anymore, with the exception of recordings that play the last post for the lowering of the flags. But in the British Army, it's much different. Their infantry units and cavalry units still have corps of drums, which are soldiers who are trained to be buglers and drummers. So the British Army, and it's still trains infantry soldiers to be buglers and drummers, and do not use musicians. Well, because they're infantrymen, they're not recruiting buglers. They're recruiting infantrymen. So regiments today don't necessarily have corps of drums, which are infantrymen. They have bands, which are musicians. So they'll recruit trumpeters for their bands and employ them as buglers, but using a trumpet. Not to my knowledge. We will use recordings if a bugler or trumpeter is not available, but we do not, one of the things we try to avoid in the Canadian Armed Forces from a dress and ceremonial point of view is what we call costuming. And costuming is where you are faking that you are. You are either an infantry bugler or you are not. So why dress as a bugler if you are not a bugler? That's why in the ceremonial guard, when they recruit drummers, they teach them to play the bugle, because we don't wish to costume. You are a bugler, a drummer, an infantry drummer, bugler, and you dress like one, and you have the potential to be one. The mouthpiece, the trumpet, ending in the bell. This cord actually is not decorative. It has a function. This is what the soldier slings over his body so that the bugle drapes across his body and lays on his hip. These tassels are just decorative tassels that secure it to it. And that's essentially it. The bugle is simple in comparison to the trumpet. There's no valves, there's no keys. There is, at the top here, there is a lock that unscrews that allows you to adjust the pitch, because we all don't play the same way, and all bugles are not the same tone. So to get the right tone, just like any other instrument, you can adjust it. But because this is an instrument or tool that is designed to be in the field, the mouthpiece is chained to the bugle. So the soldier's not going to lose the mouthpiece when he's in action.